I'm joined in the Pritchard Committee office this evening by Bridget Blum-Ramsey, our Executive Director, and Elena Morton, our Program Associate for the Governor's Commonwealth Institute for Parent Leadership, or GCIPL. And we have a few other Pritchard Committee staff joining us from their own homes this evening. We have Rachel Bellin and Melody Brooks. We are so pleased to have everyone with us tonight. Thank you for joining with us for the Pritchard Committee's inaugural Community Conversations webinar. We are pleased to launch this series of webinars to facilitate ongoing information sharing and dialogue about key educational topics. We are thrilled to see so many Pritchard Committee members, GCIPL fellows, student voice team members, teacher leaders, and other interested Kentuckians with us tonight. This evening, we will focus on a very timely issue in education. That's the new federal education law, which is called the Every Student Succeeds Act, or ESSA, or ESSA, depending upon your preference, and what this means for us here in Kentucky. Before we get started, I just wanted to share an important reminder for everyone. The Pritchard Committee has always been driven by the idea that citizen voice in education is an absolutely critical key to improving educational opportunities and outcomes for all of our young people. Since the KET town halls in 1984 to the parent institutes that have been ongoing since 1997 to each of our annual Pritchard Committee meetings and well beyond, we seek to keep you informed and underscore how important it is for the citizens to be engaged in these issues. For this evening's webinar, we are very pleased to be joined by Susan Weston, a longtime education consultant in Kentucky and dear friend of the committee. Susan will remind us about Kentucky's journey on school and district accountability and review what we might see ahead in the next few months as state policy leaders work with all of us, citizens and parents and others across the state, to design a new accountability system. We are absolutely delighted this evening to partner with the Education Trust for this discussion. The Education Trust is a national nonprofit education advocacy organization that is focused on high achievement for all students, particularly students of color and students in poverty. We have with us tonight Natasha Ushamirski, who's the Interim Director of K-12 Policy Development, as well as Kelly McManus, who's the Interim Director of Legislative Affairs. They will share more about what the new law requires and why it is important to you as a parent and community and education leader. Before we begin, I want to share some housekeeping information. First of all, we will have time for questions and discussion after Natasha and Kelly's presentation. Until that time, we will have all of the phone lines on mute so that we keep the audio clear up until that time. Please, we want this to be very interactive. So please type in your questions and comments into the questions box, and we will address them as we can. You can also press the little hand button and we will unmute your phone at that time, and then you can directly ask your question. I also want to let you know that we are recording the webinar and we'll upload it to the Pritchard Committee website as soon as we can. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Susan Weston.
Good evening, everyone. Can I get a quick signal that I'm audible?
You are very audible to me. This is
good.
Great.
Okay. All right.
Yes, you got one from Mimi as well.
Great. Okay. My assignment for this evening is to give the briefest of tours of where Kentucky has been. Corey, if you can move ahead to the start of my slides. This gives us a little prologue, a little sense of the issues Kentucky has had to decide before, and it may help in giving you some early ideas of what Kentucky may want to bring in as we revise our system to fit the new federal legislation. The three generations I'm going to talk about begin with the Education Reform Act we brought in the early 1990s, adds the additional rules we put in place to respond to federal accountability with No Child Left Behind. And for that, I do want to add that Kentucky didn't drop our own accountability with No Child Left Behind. We added some No Child Left Behind rules on top of the set of rules Kentucky was already using. In 2012, we were able to stop having those two parallel systems, and the way we did that was by, at the same moment we implemented our Kentucky Senate Bill 1, we got federal permission to change how we implement No Child Left Behind. That's formally called having been approved for flexible implementation of those rules, but everyone calls it our No Child Left Behind waiver. And I'm going to want to show you 3 slides of ways those systems have been similar and different. Can I have my next slide, Corey? The first thing to think about is what kinds of data the state wants to use to look at school and student results. Under the Reform Act, Kentucky committed to testing 7 different subjects, and we also used some non-academic data like dropouts and attendance. No Child Left Behind put attention much more narrowly on reading and math plus graduation rates. And then our current system looks at testing 5 subjects and at graduation rates. And we've added readiness results from tests showing if students are ready for college and career. We've added a way of measuring how students' results change from one year to the next that we call growth. And then we've added program reviews, which for anyone who hasn't heard of those are a way of looking at what each school offers. It's an input measure of how schools offer students opportunities to learn in the areas we don't test. That means we've got program reviews in arts and humanities and practical vocational, which we don't test anymore, and also in 3 other areas. So that's the first issue. Moving to the next slide, a second thing Kentucky has had to work on is ways of looking at results for different student groups. And here we're thinking about the groups of students that we know have not always gotten the full benefits of our public education. That includes students with disabilities or low family incomes or limited English. It also includes students of different racial ethnic backgrounds, especially for Kentucky African American students and Hispanic students. Our American Indian Native Alaskan population is pretty small, and very few schools have separately reported results for that additional group. So under our Reform Act, we took all the results for all students and all the subjects and rolled them up in a single accountability index. We did report results for each student group in each subject, but we didn't use that for accountability. No Child Left Behind pressed us to look at those results for each group. So we looked under No Child Left Behind at each group's results being addressed separately in reading and in math. Under our current system, we do have an overall score that combines all the results, but that's got a partial emphasis on group results as well, because 20 to 30% of a school's overall score comes from how the gap group is doing. And the gap group is simply a group that combines all of those groups of students that we know have historically been underserved and looks at their scores combined. We do also have some attention to the groups looked at separately in the form of our focus school rules, which put an emphasis on looking for extremely low results for any group in any subject. And that piece, so there's a piece that's still looking not at the combined gap group, but at each group separately. And then the third issue shown on the next slide is how does Kentucky handle classifying and intervening in schools based on the kinds of results we see. Under CARA, schools got recognition, and originally they got rewards money if their index met the goal set for them by the State Board of Education. And we had provisions, which I will not detail, for the ways we intervened at schools that were far below those goals. No Child Left Behind brought in provisions for intervening in tiers and different ways over a set of years at schools that missed any objective for any student group, and also added a call for intensive intervention at the schools with the lowest performance if they repeatedly miss their objectives. And then most recently in our combined system, we again combine versions of those two systems. So we recognize schools if their overall score meets goal, or if it improves faster than most schools, or if it's higher than most schools. We intervene at those focus schools with the very low results for any group, and we have intensive intervention at the schools that have the lowest performance among the schools that have missed their goals repeatedly. And we call that group the priority schools. So that's a super fast overview of how Kentucky has handled accountability at different times and kinds of options. On my next slide, I was also asked to share, can I have that slide? A little thought on concerns that people have raised about our current system, which are likely to come up as Kentucky discusses what we want to do next. One sort of bucket of concerns is about whether the overall system is ambitious enough. And concerns there include the fact that our goals for schools ask for only 1 point of improvement a year, the way our percentile-based ratings have schools competing against each other. As the program review results have come in, they're showing schools scoring themselves very high, which suggests that we don't need to improve much, which means we're not aiming for a very strong program if we're already saying most schools are there. And then the various ways we're classifying schools can be confusing, make it harder for people to see problems and mobilize and engage to address them. There are also concerns about whether the system is ambitious about getting results for each group of students and assuring that we achieve the potential of all of our students. One concern is that schools are being rated as proficient or distinguished, even if they have very low results for some groups, including qualifying as focus schools. Two others have to do with our other attempts to address gaps. The gap group results turn out to almost always mirror what's happening for students with low family incomes. That's because at most schools, those students will be 60 or 70 or 80% of the students enrolled. And at one level, it makes sense that those students are counted equally. At another level, it means gap group doesn't show you much about what's happening for minority students or students with disabilities. And then when you look at focus schools, almost all the schools being identified are identified based on what's happening for students with disabilities, because that is in fact the group that is most often showing up with the weakest performance, but it means we aren't capturing the very slightly higher performance that's coming in for some of the other disadvantaged groups. I share that to give you a tenor of the conversation and a sense of what may come up as Kentucky tries to choose its next path. My final assignment is to share a slide from the Department of Education, giving the briefest sense of the timeline Kentucky is on to revise our approach to accountability. I won't read all of this to you, but I do want to point out that the timeline begins with the public input that's being gathered right now and ends in August of next year with a goal of having a new system fully in place. And the system includes multiple points for public input, including the recent town halls, public input when a system has been drafted, focused in November, and then there are 2 state board meetings expected to happen in January and February. And as a veteran participant, I know people can also contribute considerably by sharing thoughts as those meetings are about to arrive. And that's the background I wanted to give you. And now I'll turn it back to Corey and our other speakers.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Susan. I will also point out that there is a link at the bottom of your page to a particular web page on the Department of Education's website. The Commissioner of Education, Stephen Pruitt, and Rhonda Sims, who's the Associate Commissioner for Assessment and Accountability Issues, just completed a tour of the state, including 11 town hall meetings. If you go to that page, you can actually view the videos of all of those town hall meetings, as well as summaries that the Hope Street Group teacher leaders did based on the comments presented at those meetings. You can also send in your thoughts via email to KentuckyEdListens@education.ky.gov. Susan is very helpfully pointing out that the link is very light on that page, so we will make sure that the actual link is included in your follow-up email to the webinar. So thank you again, Susan. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Natasha and Kelly to walk us through what is happening from the federal landscape on ESSA, but also to take us a bit of a step back to remind us of the importance of accountability and your role as parent and community leaders in that system. So with that, Natasha and Kelly.
Great. Well, thank you, Corey. Thank you to everyone at the Pritchard Committee for having us, and thank you, Susan, for that overview of Kentucky's path to where we are now. I think if you want to go to the next slide, Corey. I think that, as Corey mentioned, we are going to start by zooming out a bit and talking about accountability in general, and then coming back in to focus specifically on the accountability and public reporting provisions of the Every Student Succeeds Act. So bear with us a bit as we try to make sure that the context for everything happening both in Kentucky and across the country is clear. So moving on to the next slide, we'd like to start with just the general question of what do we mean by accountability? It is certainly a buzzword that has a lot of different meanings to a lot of different people, and sometimes it's considered a dirty word because of some of the connotations that come with it. But we mean by accountability the policies for measuring and holding schools responsible for student outcomes, rewarding schools that are serving all groups of students well, and prompting improvement in those that aren't. That is the whole of what we are talking about. And then again, on the next slide, one of the things we also really like to emphasize is that accountability systems in general, policies, these are not what actually moves the needle for kids. These are not, the policies themselves don't actually close the gaps or raise achievement. It is the magic that happens in excellent classrooms, the work with students and parents. That is what does it. The policies just set up a system in which that can happen. And it's important for all of us, and it's a nice reminder to us ourselves as we talk all day about policy, that all we can really do is set up the right systems for the people who work in it. But that being said, on the next slide, there are three particular characteristics that we see as really well-designed accountability systems that are focused on equity and focused on achievement for all students and all groups of students in particular. And starts with kind of a clear expectation that schools are responsible for raising achievement for all of their students, not just some. And this means that it matters how every group of students achieves. That is something that you have to pay attention to. These systems also communicate whether schools are meeting those expectations on average and for each group of students. That's a really important way that that community members, parents, educators understand how their schools are doing, is that clear communication. And then lastly, both celebrating schools that are meeting or exceeding expectations, but also prompting action in those that aren't. And so then on the next slide, another important caveat or reminder that is also comes up in kind of the rhetoric versus the reality of a good system. A good accountability system is not about sorting and punishing. It is about really that sense of responsibility, making sure that schools and systems are responsible for the performance of all groups of students and that something happens and something is done when any group falls behind. And having a really well thought out, well designed, equity-focused accountability system can be a really important lever for parents and community members to use when fighting for the improvement of your local schools. So then, moving on, another thing that to think about in the context of accountability, which obviously Susan touched on in her timeline, is that there is and there has been a federal role in this world. But one thing to really focus on is that since there has been this federal requirement for annual testing, for full public reporting, and for real accountability for the results of every group of students, we have seen achievement among Black, Latino, and low-income students improve. So paying attention to the performance of all student groups in a real way does improve results. So to start back a little bit more on the next slide, the federal role in education really got started in a meaningful way in 1965 with the passing of the Elementary and Secondary Education Act. This was part of the broader war on poverty that President Lyndon B. Johnson was initiating. The ESEA set up the Title I program, which now provides more than $14 billion, actually almost right at $15 billion to states specifically to support the education of disadvantaged students. And then as a kind of trade, if you will, for getting that money, the law also indicates what steps states have to take in order to, as a condition for receiving that. There have been multiple iterations over ESEA in the decades since it was signed into law. Initially, the focus of this money and this program was on how the funding could be used. But over the course of the past, mostly 2 to 3 decades, there has been a shift in looking at the outcomes that were expected in return for the funding and a focus on improved outcomes. So then thinking about the trajectory, in the early 90s is when a few states really did start this process by beginning to develop accountability systems, and as you heard, Kentucky was one of those. But many of these systems looked only at the overall results, the overall averages for school, not how groups of students within the school were performing. In 1994, the ESEA was reauthorized then, and at that point, it set the expectation that states had to develop accountability systems. At that point, it did not give kind of parameters or requirements around what those systems had to do. But truthfully, very few states actually moved forward with real accountability systems, and those that did still looked at the overall results only. The big kind of sea change came in 2002 with No Child Left Behind, where there was a real requirement for state accountability systems. There were specific parameters and specific requirements, but there was also the requirement that the system had to look at how each school was doing. You could know, or each group of students was doing. You could no longer say that the school was doing well when 90% of its kids were proficient, but in reality, 60% of the English learners were not proficient, for example. So one thing, there's been a lot of talk about No Child Left Behind over the past 15 years, and it was certainly far from perfect, but it did do one very important thing, and it was what I just said. It created the expectation that in order to be a good school, you had to be good for all groups of students, that you could not skate by anymore on overall averages, but you really had to take that responsibility for all of the different students that you serve. So since 2002, we have seen somewhat, in some ways, a kind of pendulum swinging back and forth on accountability, with the focus before No Child Left Behind on kind of overall results. focus on groups of students and No Child Left Behind. And then in 2011, the ESEA waivers did give states a lot more flexibility, including on how they rated schools. And what we did see was a lot of states move away from the practice of looking at each group of students. So we kind of went back to looking at more of the overall performance of a school. And so then after that pendulum swing, we had a bit of a swing in the different direction with the Every Student Succeeds Act that was signed into law in December. And Every Student Succeeds, ESSA, does include a lot of flexibility for states, but there are some very clear parameters or guardrails around what the flexibility in the accountability system can entail. And one of the things that ESSA is very clear on is that ratings in the accountability system have to be based on how schools are doing for all groups of students. And if there is any group of students who is underperforming, then the school has to take action to address that. And so with that kind of context, my colleague Natasha is going to jump in to talk more specifically about the provisions in ESSA.
Hey everybody, thank you very much for having us. So I'm going to try to walk through the accountability provisions in the law, the specific requirements. And I'm happy to answer any questions that you all have because, as usual, this stuff, whether we want it to or not, gets really weedy and really complicated really fast. So, but to get us started, if we could go to the next slide. So we're going to use 4 questions to help us walk through what ESSA requires. The first of these is, what goals do states have to set? We know that goals are a really important tool for communicating expectations and accountability, so we'll focus there first. Then, what exactly do states have to measure? How do they have to kind of take those measures and turn them into ratings? How do states have to rate schools? And then finally, which schools have to receive interventions and supports? We know that ratings are important, but we also know that just as important is what happens as a result of kind of how schools are assessed. Next slide, please. So to get us started, let's talk about the goals. So the law requires that states set ambitious long-term goals with interim benchmarks for progress. They have to set those goals on performance on state assessments, so proficiency rates in reading and math, graduation rates, and then for English learners, progress toward English proficiency. These goals have to be set both for students overall and for each group of students. And the goals have to be more ambitious for groups that are further behind so that schools are essentially incentivized to make significant progress in closing achievement gaps. Next slide, please. So what do states have to measure? The law outlines 4, we like to call them buckets, of indicators. The first is academic achievement, and that includes proficiency on annual assessments as measured against those state-set gap-closing goals. And this set of measures may also include growth, so how much progress individual students are making at the high school level. That's bucket 1. The second bucket is called this other academic indicator. For high schools, that has to be the school's graduation rate, again, as measured against those gap-closing goals. For non-high schools, states have a choice. They can use measures of individual student progress, growth, or they can use another valid, reliable, and statewide, importantly, academic indicator. States also have to measure progress toward English language proficiency for English language learners. And then they have this option to they need to add another valid, reliable, comparable, and statewide measure of school quality or student success. So this can be another measure of what we know matters for students. Things like, for example, at the high school level, participation or success in advanced courses or college entrance exams can all be part of that last bucket of indicators. All of these measures have to be disaggregated by student group. So that's a really key requirement, actually, for making sure that all of the indicators that are measured have to do with how kids are doing, For example, you can't just look at the number of classes that a school offers and make that be your indicator, because you can't look at that information by student group. What you can look at, though, is the number of students enrolled in, for example, AP or IB classes. Let's go to the next slide and talk about how those measures have to be combined into ratings. So in order to rate schools on those ratings, the law requires that states look at each of the indicators by student group. So the rating has to reflect how schools are doing on each of the measures in the accountability system for each group of students that the school serves. In putting together the rating, assessments, graduation rates or student growth, and progress towards English language proficiency have to have substantial weight. So they have to count for quite a bit. Together, these measures that are required in the law have to weigh more than that fourth bucket of indicators. And lastly, the law requires, and we think this is really important, that if a school is consistently underperforming for any group of students, the rating that the school gets has to reflect that. So it's not okay for a school to get a really high rating if it is consistently not doing well or not serving one or more groups of kids badly. Next slide, please. When it comes to interventions and supports, the law really provides a lot of flexibility for states and districts. We think that in a lot of ways this is a really good thing, right? The state and especially individual school districts know much better about the specific conditions at each school and what particular supports a school needs. At the same time, though, the level of flexibility in the law makes it really important that both parents and community advocates are really watching states and districts quite closely to make sure that they are, in fact, providing schools that are struggling with the support that they need to improve. In terms of what the law actually does specify, it mentions a couple of kinds of schools that have to receive support and interventions, and it talks about who's supposed to provide that. So the first group of schools that states and districts are required to pay special attention to are comprehensive support and improvement schools. These are schools that are really low performing, among the lowest performing 5% of schools that are getting federal dollars. This also includes all high schools with graduation rates below 67%. Each of these schools initially were supposed to work with its district on its improvement planning. But the state has to specify the criteria that the school has to meet in order to no longer fall into this category, essentially exit criteria. And if the school doesn't improve enough to meet those criteria within 4 years, then the state actually is required to take some sort of more rigorous action. Again, a lot of flexibility for the state to decide what that looks like, but there is a responsibility for the state to get involved. The other group of schools, again, that we think is really important to flag are these schools that might look okay on average, but that are consistently underperforming for one or more groups of students. These schools are supposed to receive targeted support and intervention from their districts. And the district, if the school continues to consistently underperform for a group of kids, the district is supposed to eventually take greater action. And lastly, the law flags one other group of schools that it calls additional targeted support and improvement schools. These are schools that are actually doing really, really badly, not just underperforming, but significantly underperforming for one or more groups of students. Essentially, these are schools where one or more groups is performing at the level of the bottom 5% of schools for students overall. For those schools also start out working with their districts, but in this case, the state again has to set criteria for kind of how a school exits that category, and it also has to specify a timeline within which a school has to meet those exit criteria. If the school doesn't improve sufficiently in that state-defined time frame, then that school actually is treated the same way as the lowest 5% of all schools, of all Title I schools, and gets far more intensive supports and interventions. So that's an overview of requirements. And as you were probably noticing, there are some protections and some guardrails and some requirements that will, we hope, require states, that do require states to pay attention to how schools are doing for all groups of students. But there's also a whole lot of flexibility and a lot of decisions that states and districts are going to make. And that means, again, that the role of advocates and of parents is going to be really important in making sure that these systems are really strong. So on the slide, what we've flagged are just a few questions that you might want to start asking, that you can be asking your state now, because these are decisions that are going to be made fairly quickly and that are going to play a really big role in what these systems look like. For example, there's this question about what goals will the state set. Are those goals going to be both ambitious and achievable? Are they going to lead to gap closing? And how do you know? What evidence has the state provided to show you that those goals are, in fact, both ambitious and achievable? Then there's a question about what happens if a school doesn't meet its goals, either for all students or for one or more groups of students. Does that mean that a school's rating will decline? Will the school have to take some sort of action in that case, right? The purpose of goals is to really set expectations. And so something needs to happen when those expectations are not met. The law also requires that any school that is consistently underperforming for any group take action and receive support from its districts. But the state gets to define consistently underperforming. And that definition, because it plays a big role in how schools are rated and which schools receive those supports, is going to be really important. So starting to ask, how is the state going to define consistently underperforming? Then on the supports and intervention side, again, states and districts have a whole lot of flexibility, and certainly it'd be a good idea to ask how the state and districts are going to support the lowest performing schools, as well as what are they going to do for schools that are doing okay on average, but that are really not doing well for one or more groups of students. What kinds of actions are those schools going to be required to take? And then how quickly does the state expect to see progress in those schools? And importantly, what happens if the plan doesn't work? What happens if they don't improve? What's kind of the next step? So just a few things that we would certainly encourage folks to ask at any given opportunity that you have. So that's an outline of the requirements on accountability. And we wanted to also flag for you some of the requirements around public reporting in the Every Student Succeeds Act. Accountability is a big part of public reporting, but there's a whole lot more information that needs to be made available, as you all know, than the indicators that go into an accountability system. And actually, the law is really strong on those requirements. So we wanted to highlight just a few of those on the next slide. So the law requires state and local report cards that include all the information on the slide for all schools. This information includes all of the indicators, all of the measures that go into the accountability system reported by student groups. So things like graduation rates and assessment results, assessment participation rates, student growth if the state chooses to use it, whatever the state chooses to use for that additional measure of school quality, like, as we mentioned as an example, we could use AP, Access, and Success. In addition, the law requires states to report information on student experiences, including things like discipline rates and access to advanced coursework, again by student group. It requires states to report the professional qualifications of educators, and to compare high-income and low-income schools on those qualifications, which can highlight some really important gaps in equity. Another really critical piece of information that the law requires, for the first time actually, is actual per pupil expenditures from state sources, local sources, and federal sources for each school. That's not information that's widely available right now, and we think this is going to be a really important piece of information for identifying funding inequities both across school districts and within individual school districts. The law also requires reporting of things like the number and percentage of students with significant cognitive disabilities who are taking an alternative assessment, as well as some things that have already been on school report cards, like results from the National Assessment of Educational Progress for the state. And lastly, the law requires that if a state has data available on the rate at which high school graduates matriculate in higher education, that data has to be publicly reported by student group. Now, the if available is a big caveat. So this is definitely something that you could also ask your state. Is that information available right now? If not, how do we make that information be available sooner rather than later? In terms of some questions to ask, as you see on the following slide, there's a whole lot of information that's going to be made available as a result of this law that was not available before. And one of the things that gets complicated when you have a whole lot of numbers to look at is how those numbers are presented, right? It's really easy to get lost in a huge amount of numbers. So asking your state how it's planning to present the information and making sure that they're thinking about presenting it in a way that all sorts of folks, including parents, community advocates, educators, students, can actually follow and make use of is really important. Also, you might want to ask your state how they're going to know that they're presenting it in an understandable way. When will the state ask for feedback on whatever format it is they're planning to use? And lastly, what additional kind of training, tools, and so forth will the state or districts be providing to parents and advocates to help make sure that the information is accessible and usable? So at this point, I'm going to turn things over back to Kelly to just give you a sense of what's coming up from sort of the national, federal regulatory perspective.
Right, and so unfortunately, my timeline, this implementation timeline is much less pretty and also much less detailed than what Susan put together. But on the next slide, you can see that the Department of Ed is working right now on proposed regulations. They will be developing kind of rules around accountability systems, and around assessments in particular. And those will be public and available for public comment in early summer. We anticipate that they will be in place and finalized in the fall. Obviously, this administration has a deadline on the clock that they have to meet in terms of getting anything in place that they want. All of the ESSA requirements, except for accountability, go into effect on August 1st of this year. That is when the waivers will be null and void. One caveat here, though, is that if your school is either a priority or focused school and is getting those interventions have to continue next year, even though the waiver is void. Then the new accountability system must be in place by 2017-2018. So that right there is kind of the timeline from the federal perspective. And with that, we are happy to answer any questions.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Kelly, and thank you so much, Natasha. We do have a couple of questions that have come in. So let me put them in some kind of some kind of logical order here. We have a great question from Gentry Fitch from our Student Voice team. Could you speak about the requirements from the federal level for states to involve the public as they develop their accountability system? And is there any kind of a requirement for any kind of an annual process for feedback from the community about the system?
So the law requires that states go through a meaningful consultation process, that they have to demonstrate how they have consulted with stakeholders. And there is a long list of groups that they are required to connect with. Unfortunately, students are not one of the required groups, but I am sure you all could make a strong pitch for why you should be. And so that is a requirement when the state submits its plan to get Title I dollars. So that consultation will be happening kind of throughout the course of the next year. There are also a lot of requirements for most of the funding has to include, again, stakeholder engagement, including consultation. I do not believe that there is any explicit requirement in the law for a regular kind of review or feedback process, but I do think that that would probably be kind of a best practice that we would encourage you to do. And then if there were kind of significant revisions to your state plan, if Kentucky decided to kind of dramatically change its accountability system or its assessment system or something like that in a few years, they would have to resubmit a plan, and that would require another round of meaningful consultation. So if there are significant changes after this, that is required, but in terms of anything regular, that is not an explicit federal requirement.
Great, thank you. We had a question come in via email. What requirements are in place, if you could just review this again, about the inclusion of different subjects within the accountability system? So beyond math and reading and English language arts, what is the extent to which states will incorporate science, social studies, and other subjects within their systems? Or is that something that's purely up to states?
Math and reading are the only two subjects that are absolutely required. However, the law does require states to look at that additional academic indicator and another indicator of school quality. So there is certainly a lot of opportunity to use assessments in other subject areas as part of those indicator buckets.
Great, thank you. And then we have a question from Andrew Brennan from our Student Voice team and Pritchard Committee member. Could you go into a little bit more depth about how students with different disabilities or students with learning differences are counted within the accountability system itself? So currently in Kentucky, they're wrapped up in a larger super subgroup called the GAP group, but we understand under ESSA they will be their own group. Is there anything about students with any particular disabilities and how they might be counted on their own, or is it pretty much the way that it's been in the past?
So you are absolutely right in that the ESSA does not allow states to look at a super group like the GAP group that combines different groups of students together instead of looking at individual student groups. So under ESSA, states will have to look at the performance of students with disabilities separately kind of as a specific group, because as we know, that group has different kinds of needs, right? And it is incredibly important to pay attention to the needs of those students. In terms of breaking that group down further, generally no, the law does kind of have one group called the group of students with disabilities, but I think one other place where this comes into play is the law allows up to 1% students in the state to be tested using an alternative assessment. And this is really meant for students with the most significant cognitive disabilities. Statewide, no more than 1% of students can take that assessment. Individual districts that have more students with severe cognitive disabilities can kind of work with their state and perhaps to have more students take that test. But there is this kind of statewide cap to make sure that as many students as possible are taking the regular assessment so that their performance can be compared to all students, and really to kind of encourage schools to include all students in a regular curriculum.
I was going just to add on, this provision was really important for disability advocates because as they saw before No Child Left Behind, when students with disabilities were not considered kind of as a subgroup in the accountability system, they were often not assessed. They were often not, there was very little effort made for inclusion. And students with disabilities had some incredibly dramatic improvement over the course of the No Child Left Behind years because their performance mattered. And so making sure that we didn't step backwards on that was really important to the disabilities community.
Okay, that's a great clarification. We will take 2 more questions. I'm actually going to call on Jean St. John. The hand is raised, so I'm going to unmute you real quick and see if you can ask your question via the phone line. We'll see if this works.
Can you hear me?
I can.
Oh, very good. I'm with the Kentucky Arts Council, and I'm the Arts Education Director. And I'm trying to find, listening to all of this, what will the role of the arts be? What kind of requirements in there as we're moving ahead with the program reviews? How will this affect arts education in our state?
Well, I think that is largely a question for y'all and up to Kentucky. And there is no requirement that the arts be included in the kind of big A accountability system. There are in other places in the law certainly grant funds and other opportunities to promote arts education and to fund arts education, but it is not a requirement for inclusion in the system. I think one thing to consider, though, is when we're thinking about other indicators of school quality, if you want to look at the percentage of students from each group who have access to an arts classes. That would be similar to thinking about how you could measure something like that, but in a disaggregated way based on students. That would probably be the only way that it would fit.
I would actually think about it more from a school improvement perspective. You know, one of the things that we know from, we at the Education Trust spend a lot of time studying high poverty, high performing schools. One of the things that we know about these schools is that they work really hard to provide all of their students with a really rich curriculum, very much including the arts. And that's really kind of a key strategy for them as part of their improvement process. So as you're thinking of a school that is struggling for all students, or if it's struggling for a group of students, I would say that one of the things you want to look at is what sort of curriculum kids are getting access to in that school. And that might be another place where you could kind of leverage the improvement process to make sure that the arts play a really important role, as they should.
Great. Thank you, Jean. Thank you, Natasha and Kelly. We have one quick question, and then I will wrap us up. Kelly, Natasha, would you clarify the timeline for states to release the school level funding data? Do they have to publish it in 2016-17 for prior year funding, or is it later down the timeline?
Well, unfortunately, this is one of those interesting questions that we are just not clear on, despite many people asking the department for much more specificity in terms of timeline. We do know that the department, the general kind of public reporting is an area that the department is looking to regulate. So I would imagine that there will be much more direction on that coming soon. At this point, I would be hard-pressed to imagine that you would have to kind of go back and look at this, but again, the department has not given any time frame for when that provision will actually have to be in effect.
Okay, got it. Wonderful. Well, thank you all so much kindly again. We very much appreciate all of you for joining us this evening. We will post a recording of the webinar on our website, and we will be sending you a follow-up email tomorrow with additional resources. I would encourage you to watch the Pritchard blog at pritchblog.blogspot.com. Susan is our founding author of the Pritch blog, and a number of us are blogging as well, so we will work to keep you informed. We do have a blog post up there now that includes some fact sheets that the Education Trust partnered with us on to review the accountability and public reporting requirements within the law. So just stay tuned. I would also encourage you to mark your calendar for our next webinar, which will be Thursday, July 21st, also from 7:30 to 8:30. We are very pleased to be joined by Robert Podisco from the Fordham Institute and Lisa Hansel, who is with the Knowledge Matters campaign. They're going to be explaining some of the new kind of information that's out that does just what Natasha said of really clarifying the benefits of a well-rounded curriculum and really digging into opportunities within ESSA to incentivize that well-rounded education. So we'd love to have you join and invite your friends along as well. So thank you all again, and please feel free to contact us at any time with questions or with feedback on this webinar or other topics that you would like to see in the future. Thanks to all, and have a great rest of your evening.